and 13 on the right track in the months to come.
The message is simple, Mike. This summer we're all shows and no long breaks. And 653 Park Slope residents joined us last summer because they thought it was a great idea. But we need to hear from more of you. We need to raise the $750,000 we normally get during our August drive. If it's time to renew your membership, send out your check tonight. If you're already a member and you've received our special letter, please read it and take the time to respond. And thank you.
Good evening. Leading the news this Tuesday, shipping was normal in the Persian Gulf despite Iranian naval threats. The Iran-Contra committees took CIA testimony in private. The Federal Communications Commission voted to drop the fairness doctrine for broadcasters. We'll have details in our news summary in a moment. Jim?
After the news summary, we look at the accomplishments of the Iran-Contra hearings with some public reaction and with former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, columnist Ray Price, historian Arthur Schlesinger, and commentator Ben Wattenberg. Then Elizabeth Brackett updates the story of what the Challenger tragedy did for Morton Thiokol, and we close with a Roger Mudd essay on the fight over Robert Bork.
Funding for the MacNeil-era News Hour is provided by AT&T, combining everything people like about telephones with everything they expect from computers to make everything about information easy. AT&T. Funding also is provided by this station and other public television stations and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
All was reported normal for shipping in the Persian Gulf today, despite noisy threats from Iran and warnings to stay clear of its naval maneuvers. With those exercises in the second of 3 days, Iranian broadcast said its missiles were ready, and the Navy commander said his forces are fully prepared to take revenge on the United States. In Washington, the Pentagon professed to be unconcerned.
We have our plans and our mission, and we intend to carry it out. We don't accept the threats or other claims of specific closures as being relevant to our operations, and so we'll continue to carry out our mission there.
But today, ranking officers told the Associated Press it was unlikely another convoy operation would be mounted until next week, when the Iran maneuvers would be over. Delaying the next convoy would also allow more time for 8 minesweeping helicopters to reach the Gulf. Jim?
The Nicaraguan Contras stepped back on the Washington stage today. The Associated Press and other news organizations reported the possibility of a deal between the White House and congressional leaders. It provides for delaying aid to the Contras if the Nicaraguan government agrees to a ceasefire, among other things. The report said something definitive may be announced tomorrow. The leaders of the Contra movement were in Washington today. They met with Secretary of State Schultz and gave an upbeat report of what the Iran-Contra hearings have done for their cause. Secretary Schultz and Contra leader Adolfo Calero talked to reporters after their meeting.
It's been very encouraging to me to see the coherence of this directorate and to meet once again with the outstanding people who are working and fighting to bring about peace and openness and democracy in their country.
The Iran hearings were an opportunity for American people to hear about the Nicaraguan cause, and it did help to get American people educated, because as they learn about the situation, the more favorable they are for our cause. I think we came out of the Iran hearings smelling like a flower. There has been no embarrassment whatsoever.
The Iran-Contra committees did take some more testimony today, but it was behind closed doors. The witness was Dwayne Claridge, the CIA's chief of counterterrorism. And in St. Paul, Minnesota, there was a court decision today that bears on the Central America issue. A federal judge ruled governors of states do not have the constitutional right to forbid National Guardsmen from training in Central America. The Minnesota governor was one of several who had taken just such action.
The Federal Communications Commission today voted to scrap the fairness doctrine, which has governed broadcasting for 38 years. The doctrine requires broadcasters to present differing views on controversial issues. Broadcasters claimed it violated their First Amendment rights. The commission ruled that the doctrine was no longer necessary because there were enough TV and radio stations to ensure diversity of views. Fearing that the FCC would drop the regulation, Congress voted earlier this year to make it law, but President Reagan vetoed that bill. Members of both houses vowed today to renew their attempts to keep the doctrine in force.
There was good news today about the heat wave, finally. A cold front made its way slowly over the Midwest, causing National Weather Service forecasters to predict probable breaks in the devastating heat that has swamped the eastern two-thirds of the United States for the last 2 weeks. At least 89 deaths have been blamed on those high temperatures.
Peace was declared today in the 4-year-old civil war in Sri Lanka. Tamil guerrillas announced they would lay down their arms as part of an Indian-brokered peace accord. The guerrillas had been fighting to establish an independent homeland for the Tamils in the northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka. The peace agreement will attempt to redress some of the Tamil grievances. And the Soviets said today that the young West German pilot who flew a light plane to Red Square will be tried on charges that could mean up to 10 years in prison. 19-year-old Matthias Rust is charged with illegal entry into the Soviet Union, violating international rules, and malicious hooliganism. The announcement said the charges had been approved by the state prosecutor's office and sent to the Soviet Supreme Court to decide when and where the trial will be held.
And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now the Iran-Contra hearings as seen by Barbara Jordan, Arthur Schlesinger, Ray Price, Ben Wattenberg, and others. An update of the Morton Thiokol story and a Roger Mudd essay. Two of the most overused words during the 41 days of the Iran-Contra hearings were American people. Both witnesses and questioners continually pronounced themselves to be only on the side of the American people. The American people demand an explanation. The American people have a right to know, to expect better, and so on and so on. Well, 24 hours after the public hearings ended, we hear tonight what some real American people have to say about the hearings. They include 4 seasoned political observers who have exchanged views with us before, and some Americans in Chicago who talked to correspondent Elizabeth Brackett.
Do you think the hearings were a positive or a negative for the country?
I think they were positive. It gives us an idea, watching, to see what's going on. I mean, I personally wouldn't have known. I would have believed, or almost believed, what was told by the president. I mean, you want to believe him. You want to think he's telling the truth. So I think it was good. It gives us better insight.
It's sad that you have to show your dirty laundry or whatever, but I think the people should know what's going on, and they have a better concept of it if they see someone saying and explaining it on TV than if it's in a newspaper. And I don't think as many people would read it in the newspaper, but with such televised information, they had no choice but to see it on TV because it was on all day long. It was on every station. It was on the news every day. Every newscast had it on, and they had no choice but to hear it.
I think that the initial idea of having those sessions was valid. I think that not enough has come out of them in terms of the total involvement of the people that we've seen on the tube. I think there's a lot more to it than has been presented thus far.
What questions do you still want answers to?
What was the involvement of the president? What was his degree of knowledge in this whole affair? And I don't think we're going to find that out because I think it's been rehearsed very well, and I think everybody involved has played a role that was, to me, orchestrated.
So you're saying you think there was a cover-up?
Yes, I believe that.
I don't have the impression that there was a cover-up beyond the NSC. It does seem to me that the President and the Attorney General moved fairly swiftly as was politically feasible for them to do. and were fairly forthcoming in providing information after the fact.
Do you think the president knew that some of that money may have gone to the Contras?
Oh, yeah, sure. I think he knew about the whole operation. That's my thinking.
Do you think the president has lied?
Yeah. In fact, I think all of them lied.
As you look back over them now, what or who stands out in your mind?
Well, certainly Colonel North stands out to be the most articulate and really believable guy. But as far as Reagan knowing about it, I don't know who's the better actor.
What's your impression now of Oliver North? Do you think he was an American hero?
Well, I don't know if he was an American hero or not. I thought he was a very interesting personality. My impression of this situation compared with Watergate was how much more interesting the participants were and how much more they had a soul this time. That doesn't mean that they might not be more dangerous for that, but that they were more interesting. I don't know that you'd call Colonel North a hero for this set of actions. I presume he was a quite accomplished soldier and could be called a hero for that.
I think he might have been a hero in the past, but I don't think he's a hero for covering up for something that was illegal. If something is illegal, it is, and he shouldn't be covering for someone else. He should be telling the truth.
Do you think John Poindexter was lying, or was the president lying?
It's difficult for me to believe, as it's been stated, that there was no knowledge on the part of the president that John Poindexter would have acted totally on his own and disregard informing the President of the United States.
Do you think the president knew about the diversion or not?
I don't think so. Originally, I thought he did. When they first came out and said no, he didn't know. I thought that was kind of strange because how could a president run the country and not know these things? But then as the investigation went on, it sort of changed my opinion because of all the shielding that people were doing for him. So it was conceivable that he didn't know, although I think he should have. He should have known what was going on.
Has it changed your opinion of the president one way or the other?
Makes him more human, doesn't it? Not really. I mean, he did come out and say that there had been mistakes made, excuse me. But it does make you think that there are other things that they aren't telling us too, which there probably are.
Yeah, you never get above the law. I mean, we've made the law, and I don't think anyone is above the law, including the president. If he did wrong, he has to pay just like anybody else. When you do wrong, you have to pay.
Should Oliver North
violate the law, then you got to pay.
Should Oliver North and John Poindexter go to jail?
Sure, they did wrong. Should send them right to jail. Let them do time, like everyone else when they do wrong.
I'd hate to see it. Because now everybody's going to say, you know, well, Colonel North, well, he's the big hero and everything. And, you know, I'm going to say that I think Poindexter should go to jail, if anything. Because as far as Colonel North knew, he, you know, figured that the president knew all along. That's what I believe.
What kind of a job do you think Congress did in conducting this investigation? What did you think of the senators and the congressmen?
I found some of them to be very articulate, but I think a lot of them were in there basically egos or showboating or, you know, more or less a free political advertisement.
Well, I think they did a swell job. They did a fine job in this case. They did a wonderful job, and I think it's still more to, I think that it will be later, that it will be more information brought up, and they probably have some more hearings on some other people after this.
I don't know, I think we tend to have one of these up and down sensations, that there's a kind of joy in seeing democracy operate like this. On the other hand, there's a kind of opposite reaction to seeing ourselves put in a bad position like this. I think from the point of view of people outside the United States, it must be very difficult for our allies to depend upon us when they know that things like this can be brought to light so easily. And I think it may be very hard for our enemies to take us seriously sometimes when they know that opposition in the United States can make this big a situation out of something that is really a dispute over policy when you get right down to it. And it makes it very difficult to conduct foreign affairs in that environment.
So is that a positive or a negative in the end?
I think that's a negative for our foreign affairs, but I mean, it's always a positive for our citizens to see the system operate so well.
For another view of the impact of the hearings, we have reassembled the 4 distinguished observers who've joined us several times this year. Former Kennedy aide and presidential scholar Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, who served in the House Judiciary Committee that considered the impeachment of Richard Nixon. She now teaches at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Ray Price, former Nixon speechwriter and now columnist. And Ben Wattenberg, former speechwriter for President Johnson, now a columnist, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he's co-editor of Public Opinion magazine. Ray Price, when the hearings took a break in June, you told us you didn't think they were necessary and not helpful. Do you still think so?
I still think so. They were a public entertainment, at times a riveting public entertainment. In terms of the national interest, I don't think we gained as much as we lost from them. And bear in mind that they did show a lot of things that had to be cleaned up in the administration. They showed a very flawed policy process last year, but what had to be cleaned up had already been cleaned up before the hearings began. The president had cleaned house in the White House. He'd brought in a new chief of staff, new NSC advisor, new national security staff, and he was not going to be swapping arms for hostages again, no way. And the new people are in place, the processes have been cleaned up. So what we've been looking at is past history. It is not anything that presently needs correction. On the administration side, on the congressional end, it's a different thing. They still need to clean up their act.
Barbara Jordan, not necessary, not helpful, the hearings?
The hearings were extraordinarily helpful. At the conclusion of the hearings, my first reaction was the Republic has survived again. I think that, Robin, it means a lot to the American people, just as we've heard these people expressing early in the program, to see their government at work. And for Ray Price to say they were not helpful, however, policies were flawed and that is being corrected and changes are being made. Changes are being made because these hearings brought out the need for these changes. And I think, on balance, they were a good thing.
Ben Wattenberg, you had heard that young man in Chicago say it was really just a dispute over policy.
Well, it was more than just a dispute over policy. The man I liked was the fellow who said that it was a great joy in seeing democracy operate. I had a lot of problems with these hearings, as you know. I think there was a lot of demagoguery and a lot of showbiz, and it did make us look bad to our allies and some of our adversaries. On the other hand, in a very earthy sort of a way, it was a grand 200th birthday present for the Constitution. I mean, this is a muscular, sweaty democracy we live in, where people beat up on each other's head, and we saw it done pretty well, and it was very, very fascinating. I stayed up many nights late watching just the drama of it, and it was, in a very real sense, a great civics lesson.
What do you think,
the good, the bad, and the ugly of it.
To quote Colonel North, what do you think, Arthur?
Well, I can't imagine a better way to celebrate the bicentennial of the Constitution than to have these hearings. Because what the hearings did was to remind us of the relevance of the plan established by the framers of the Constitution to our own lives. It seems to me it was a great vindication of the Constitution, a great proof of its continuing vitality, and a great argument for the preservation of the balance between power and accountability, which is the heart of the constitutional system. And I think what happens in our frame of government is that when power is abused, corrective forces emerge as a result of the separation of powers to restore the constitutional balance. I think this is what is happening, has been happening in these hearings, and I think it's a great thing.
It's 3 cheers for democracy, Ray Price, and 1 faint jeer here. What do you?
I guess I'm the only one who's not for democracy. I appreciated what Ben said before about it being a great birthday present for the Constitution. I don't think we can afford an awful lot of this kind of present. It was fun. It was a learning experience for a lot of people. I don't think they learned anything they couldn't have learned if they had taken the trouble to without the hearings. Now, we are in a television age, and people do depend on the tube for a lot of what they learn. But I can't think of anything significant that we learned from these hearings, and I stress significant, that we would not otherwise have known. We knew that things were screwed up in the White House. We knew that a flawed policy had been entered into and carried out. We knew that there was a lot of dissension among cabinet people and between Secretary of State and the NSC advisor and so forth. And we knew that a lot of repairs had to be made, and I would correct Barbara on one thing, that I don't think it was because of the hearings that these changes were made, because they had been made before the hearings began. That was a significant part.
Ray, we learned, I think, that the cause of the Contras, many people in America learned, was perceived of by many intelligent people as a noble, worthwhile, democratic cause. And I wouldn't worry too much about the Congress having too many of these TV firestorm extravaganzas, because in many ways it proved to be a two-edged sword, that if there was, in fact, as many people would maintain, a partisan agenda against the president and a partisan agenda against the Contras, that has surely backfired. I mean, television is a remarkable and a remarkably potent instrument, as Colonel North, the Teflon colonel, showed. And they're going to be very, very leery and wary of doing this too many times.
Is Ben Wartenberg right? Has it backfired on that score against the Democrats in Congress?
It has not backfired. It has not backfired. I wonder, Ray Price, did you know so many people were liars who were in high office in the government of this country? Maybe you did know that, since you did serve in the White House, but it was a revelation for a number of people that so many people would blatantly and outright lie, just lie to the Congress, lie to their superiors, and admit it, and sort of wear it as a badge of honor. Yes, there has been some temporary rise in support for the Contras on the part of the American people as a result of these hearings. Is that rise in support so significant that we can say a majority of the American people support the Contra cause? The answer is no.
Well, Barbara, it went from 2-1 against to just about 50-50. And now suddenly we saw at the top of the news now that the president and Majority Leader Wright are suddenly sitting down and trying to work out something. I don't even know what it is, but that is as you know from politics, that is quite a remarkable rise. Now, it can be ephemeral and disappear. On the other hand, the president may be able to build on it.
Do you agree with Mr. Calero, Arthur Schlesinger, that the Contras came out smelling like a flower?
I wouldn't think so for a moment. I think some of the most damning testimony about the Contras came from some of the lower White House agents. The reports, for example, the fellow named Owen, about how the Contras were phonies, how they weren't putting up a fight and all that kind of thing. I think that a full assessment of what the testimony said about the Contras is going to be rather damaging.
Arthur,
just let him finish, Ben.
No, I think the issues of the Contras are going to be debated and fought out, and I think as that debate continues, it'll be evident that the policy of militarizing the conflict in Central America, policy of making Honduras into an armed camp, policy of bringing pressure of the kind we've been bringing in Costa Rica and so on, will be understood that far from blocking the spread of communism, the policy of the administration is more likely to accelerate the spread of communism in Central America. And I think that, which is the basic issue, will emerge during the debate.
What do you think, Ray Price, about Ben Wartenberg's point that you didn't like the hearings, but he believes they've done the Contras a lot of good?
I think he's absolutely right, and I think that is the one good thing that really has come out of them. It's not just the current polls on for and against support. And as Ben points out, the level of support, the level of public support for giving the aid to the countries has risen substantially. That may not hold, but the important thing is that they were an important education to the public in where and what Nicaragua was and what the significance was. One recent poll, for example, showed that only 1/3 of the voting age people queried even knew that Nicaragua, even knew that it was even in Latin America or Central America. Now that gives the basis for an education. And now, if the president really takes it to the country, I think he may be able to win on this, and it's going to be important if he does.
Education is likely to cut two ways on that. When they discover that Nicaragua is a country of about 2.7 million people, about the size of a borough of New York City, most of whom are living in dire poverty, I think it's very hard for them to regard this as a mortal threat to the security of the United States.
But I think that if they also learn, as they will, that Nicaragua has an armed force that overwhelms those of all the rest of Central America, that this strategically vital thin waist of the hemisphere is threatened by the Soviet Union through its puppet Nicaragua. As this begins to sink in, they will realize that we are confronting the imminent reality of a major Soviet presence in the...
And they will also learn that the one thing that Nicaragua is not going to do is to use its armed forces to invade another country. That would trigger the real...
Well, Barbara Jordan lives in Texas, which is much nearer to Nicaragua than the rest of you do. Let's go to Barbara Jordan and change the subject slightly. Ben Wattenberg said, some demagoguing, some posturing. How do you think, you've been a member of congressional hearings, televised congressional hearings. You've been subjected to the same temptations, I'm sure, to maximize the opportunities on television. How did these committees handle this in terms of the way they handled the witnesses, the way they handled themselves?
All right. I think that there was one real problem with the Iran-Contra hearings, and that is the license which they gave, the committee chairman and others gave counsel to drive the hearings. We had the counsel for the committee asking the questions, setting the framework for the debate, really posturing a conflict between Oliver North and the Congress. And that was not what the hearings were all about. Oliver North, and it was not Oliver North against the Congress or the Congress against Oliver North. The counselors are the ones who made Oliver North a hero. And when the mail started to come in to show the public reaction to Oliver North, then members of Congress, being very sensitive to public opinion, decided that they would get on the defensive a little bit and try to, before asking any question, saying, listen, I'm all for Colonel North, he is a patriot, and all the rest of it. That, to me, was the big error in these hearings, that it was the elected members of Congress which should frame the debate and frame the questions, and not the counsel.
And you think that changed the dynamics of the hearing?
I think it did. I think it made it into some kind of a prosecutorial forum instead of analytic and fact-finding forum, which it was supposed to be.
I think the best single performer and the man who turned it around even more, I think, than Oliver North was his counsel, Brendan Sullivan of I Am Not a Potted Plant. I mean, he demonstrated something. See, congressmen in these hearings and senators are normally dealing with people who need the Congress. They are either government officials or they are lobbyists, and they are extremely deferential. When you get a witness and a counsel up there who doesn't need the Congress for anything, after all, North's problem is with the independent counsel, that this guy was able to break all the china there and get extremely tough and saying, you're pushing around my client, how dare you do this? Speaking in a tone of voice that in a normal congressional hearing, somebody would have hit him on the head with the gavel, but because this was national television, they couldn't touch him, and consequently North, in his sort of boyish manner, was able to make all his points without anybody laying a glove on him.
Arthur Sosner?
I'd like to recur to an earlier point, and that is the reference was made to the fact that this was a kind of partisan committee operating on a partisan agenda. I don't think that's so at all. I think one of the striking things about it was the non-partisan quality of the questioning. Both Senator Redmond of New Hampshire, a Republican, Senator Cohen of Maine, a Republican, Senator Tribble of Virginia, a Republican, were as penetrating in their questions as any of the Democrats on the committee. I thought that, again, this was a kind of vindication of the... Woodrow Wilson used to say that the informing process informing function of the Congress is even to be preferred to the legislative function. And the Parliament used to sit as a grand inquest on the affairs of state. I thought this was an enormous vindication of the traditional role of Congress, and I don't think it was at all a partisan maneuver. I think it was a real institutional effort to restore the balance of the Constitution.
Senator Rudman said yesterday at the end he thought the hearings had been conducted in a remarkably fair and bipartisan manner. Did you agree with him, Ray Price?
Not entirely. I think they did get better toward the end, and I agree entirely with Barbara on the change that took place as soon as the mail began coming in from their mistreatment of Oliver North, or at least their perceived mistreatment, and from the prosecutorial tone they had adopted at first. And so they tried to present themselves, I think they were overwhelmingly concerned with the way they presented themselves, in a more measured kind of a way. And it did become, toward the end, more of an inquiry into what happened and less of an attempt to...
Well, let's go into the inquiry, what happened, into the substance of the thing. In the Washington Post today, Haynes Johnson says, if you analyze what the four chairmen said in their wrap-up statements yesterday, they all seem to embrace the fall guy story that North said had been arranged, that he and Poindexter would take the rap. Do you think, how do you view the outcome, the sort of net outcome of what we now know about the deal as revealed by the hearings? Barbara Jordan?
I think the net outcome, Robin, is that the ends in this democracy, the ends will never justify the means. It cannot, because if you work on the assumption that the ends justify the means, then you foreclose any values, any virtue. There is no opportunity to assess what is right or what is wrong if you're going to let the ends drive the matter. That, I think, we learned. I believe we learned that the National Security Council must never become operational, and certainly not in a covert manner. We also learned that this is a government of laws and not of men, and the rule of law must prevail, and we still are going to see that lesson further carried out by the independent prosecutor.
Ben Wartenberg, what did we learn in terms of who managed the deal and in terms of your perception of who we believe?
Well, I think the driving force behind both the selling of arms to Iran and helping the Contras was none other than Ronald Reagan. The idea that he was some detached, amiable dunce is simply not true. He wanted to send the weapons to the Iranians, and the weapons were sent. He wanted to aid the Contras. He apparently didn't know about the diversion, but as Poindexter pointed out, he felt he had a more general writ. He wanted to help the Contras. There was a memo of the NSC that said that. Let's do all we can for the Contras to keep them alive while the Congress is dithering. And Ronald Reagan, he did some very foolish things, particularly the selling of the missiles to the Iranians. But he was a man who comes through as in charge and driving the engine of government, albeit sometimes foolishly, and not following up on all the details. And you can fault him for being foolish, but not for being detached.
How do you see what our understanding of the dynamics of this thing now that the hearings are over?
Well, I think it's puzzling. I think the things that the inquiry has not found out may never be found out. I find it hard to believe that President Reagan did not know about the diversion of the funds to the Contras. It seems to me that it's very possible that he and Poindexter are playing out a game of plausible deniability.
Still playing a game.
Still playing a game. I noticed that when Reagan learned of Poindexter's testimony, that he'd taken all these steps and not told the president about it, whereas a normal president would have reacted with outrage at this usurpation of his authority. Reagan's spokesman said that the president heard this testimony with gratification. I think, and then when Poindexter heard that Reagan said that he would have disapproved had he known about it, Poindexter said, in effect, I expected him to say that. I think they're playing out a game of plausible deniability. Poindexter is the fall guy, but who can tell? I don't know, but I am very skeptical that Reagan, particularly if he's this demonic figure in charge, as portrayed by Ben Wartenberg, I do not believe he didn't know about the diversion of funds to the Contras.
Arthur, maybe you could ask your new guru, Robert Owen, Oliver North's gopher, who you quoted as some great seer. I mean, if
I
it's information you want...
I just quoted him as an interesting witness on the value of the Contras.
But I would take what Robert Owen says with about a box full of salt.
Let's go to Ray Price here. You're a supporter of President Reagan. In our previous conversations you have been. There must be a dilemma for supporters of the president trying to decide who is telling the truth in this, because there are so many apparent contradictions. I mean, between senior cabinet members like Schultz and Weinberger as opposed to the members of the National Security Staff. Who do you believe?
Well, life is contradictions. And I don't know for sure who to believe. I do think certainly that however they got into it, the policies were those, the basic policies were those of the president. And he was determinedly behind them, so much so on the arms for Iran that he overrode his secretaries of state and defense. He can be very willful in that sort of thing. On the diversion of funds, to me, frankly, that's not that important an issue. It's not a moral issue, certainly. My guess is that Poindexter was probably telling the truth, that he probably did try to protect the president. And my guess also is that if the president had known about it at that time, Poindexter's probably right at that time, he probably would have approved it. Now, in retrospect, he would not. I think that's probably also true. Now, certainly the costs of doing so have been much more clearly seen. These were legal costs. I would go back, though, to Barbara's point about a government of laws and so forth. We are that. But there's an important distinction between a government of laws and a tyranny of legalisms. And what we've absolutely got to have, and to me this is one of the compelling lessons of the hearings, is that we have got to so structure our laws in a system of separated powers so that each branch can operate effectively within its own sphere of responsibility. And I think the great failure in recent years has been the intrusion of Congress increasingly and destructively into the executive's necessary sphere of operational responsibility.
Am I to think then that you believe that separation of powers, three branches of government, separation of powers, that's tyranny of legalisms? Is that what you're calling that way?
Not that the separation of powers is a tyranny of legalisms. No, separation of powers is a very exquisite device to share power and to exercise it. But it requires restraint on the part of each of the three branches. You've got to have judicial restraint, you've got to have a measure of executive restraint, you've also got to have a measure of legislative restraint.
Does it entail lying?
It may. It doesn't necessarily, but it invites lying if the legislature so ties the hands of the president that he cannot carry out his basic responsibility for the security of the nation without transgressing one of these legalisms that Congress has put in his way.
Ray, yes. Congress is exercising a perfectly appropriate right.
I'm not talking about the hearings. I'm talking about the laws that has been passed.
Or the Boland Amendment or whatever. That's the appropriation of power of Congress. Congress is the powers of foreign policy are shared powers. The president does not own foreign policy. In fact, the most important powers of foreign policy were given by the framers to Congress. That is the power to declare war, the powers to issue letters of market reprisal,
it gave Congress the power
to appropriate money, and so on.
We have just a couple of minutes left. Let me put to you a question that intrigues a lot of people because it goes to the sequel of all these events. Ben Wattenberg, starting with you. The suggestion has been raised by some, notably Pat Buchanan, that the president should, at some appropriate time, pardon North and Poindexter. What do you feel about that?
I think the process has got to work its way all the way through to the end. See if there's an indictment, have a jury trial, see if any jury in America is going to sentence Oliver North for taking a $14,000 fence to protect his babies from Abu Nidal, which I doubt. And then if he is convicted and he is on his way to the slammer, at that point the president ought to seriously consider pardoning him. And my guess is unless something comes out that is more venal than anything we've seen, I would probably support that, but only after the process has played its way out. And I would guess that most of those members of Congress, and many of whom I just wanted to point out were extremely effective and articulate on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, I don't see that most of the politicians would want to see Oliver North behind bars.
Barbara Jordan?
I'm not looking to see anybody behind bars, but I am looking to see the laws of this country obeyed. An independent prosecutor was appointed by this administration because they felt that laws had been disobeyed. And for the president to then, in turn, if the independent prosecutor says these laws were violated and this is the action which must be taken, and the president then says, I pardon all of these people, I think that turns the rule of law on its head. And I would hope that the president would not do that.
Ray Price?
Certainly there should be nothing done or even contemplated on it now. I think perhaps if it plays itself out, and if we don't find anything more than we know now about what they have done, and if they are convicted, then I think it might be appropriate at that time.
Let justice be done, and let us not anticipate the result. But I do think that if Reagan ever pardons Poindexter, this will be taken by many people as proof that Poindexter has something on Reagan, and that they have played a game of plausible deniability to the end.
We have to leave it there. Ben Wattenberg, thank you. Barbara Jordan, Ray Price, Arthur Schlesinger. Thank you all.
Next, an update on the effort to get the nation's space program back on track. Today, engineers at a Morton Thiokol plant in Utah took another step. They successfully fired a rocket segment containing a joint that's been redesigned to prevent the leakage of superhot gases, the problem that caused the Space Shuttle Challenger to blow up a year and a half ago. Today's test was just the latest of many, as correspondent Elizabeth Brackett reports.
The test rocket roared to life in the foothills of the Utah mountains in late May. The first full-scale test of a solid rocket motor since the Challenger disaster. The test included only a few of the fixes designed for the rocket joint that failed on the Challenger. But employees of NASA and Morton Thiokol let out a sigh of relief as the billowing clouds of spent fuel from the $13 million test drifted skyward. Among those whose eyes were glued to the belching rocket, the 5 astronauts who will fly on the first shuttle flight since the accident. That flight still a year away.
We're obviously interested in witnessing the test firing, which we recognize is step one, as was said earlier, in getting us back into manned spaceflight.
In a post-test briefing, a Thiokol engineer who had urged NASA not to launch the night before the disastrous Challenger accident said the successful test meant America's space program was back on track.
And as far as finally seeing a full-scale solid rocket motor test again, it was absolutely jubilant for me, because there were times when I wondered if it ever happened. So I'm very happy about the whole thing today.
But there are many who criticize NASA's decision to stick with Morton Thiokol as the sole supplier of the shuttle's critical booster rockets. The faulty joint on the rocket manufactured by Morton Thiokol has been pinpointed as the mechanical cause of the shuttle disaster. Congressman James Scheuer.
It offends me. If ever we had a contractor who, by their own record, does not deserve to be a sole source contractor, Morton Thiokol fits that bill to a T. I think it's wrong. I think it's shameful that we haven't gone to a competitive mode and invited other major contractors in.
But NASA says dropping Morton Thiokol would have meant an unacceptable delay in getting the shuttle flying again. Deputy Director of NASA, Dale Myers.
Why did you decide to go back to Morton Thiokol after the accident?
We didn't have any choice. It would have been another major delay in the system, probably 3 or 4 years more, if we were to go to a new rocket engine manufacturer to build the rockets that are presently used on the shuttle, or to build a new rocket to be used on the shuttle.
So in February, NASA announced a restructured contract with Morton Thiokol. Before the accident, the company had a $605 million contract. After the accident, the renegotiated contract jumped to $1.3 billion. Thiokol did agree to do $409 million of redesign work for no profit and pay a $10 million penalty as a result of the accident. Still, the profit from the contract remained substantial. Before the accident, Thiokol's potential profits were $90 million. Now the company stands to make up to $86 million. Congressman Robert Torricelli was outraged by the restructured contract.
Morton Thiokol certainly hasn't paid a price. They are involved in perhaps the largest federal contract that exists without competition. It is enormously profitable. They suffered from gross negligence in how they performed under that contract, and now they continue, in my judgment, without missing a beat.
Hundreds of Morton Thiokol employees lost their jobs after the Challenger explosion, though most have now been rehired. And as a result of the redesign effort, there are now 700 job openings. Still, the president of the Aerospace division of Morton Thiokol says the company has paid a price for the disaster.
We did accept a $10 million penalty, and we accepted $400 million worth of work at no fee, which is a tremendous profit hit. I think it's unprecedented. I think we did take a big hit. It has hurt. We were very fortunate, and the other business in our corporation was able to fill in, and so from a total corporate standpoint, we were able to handle that or manage it, but even that shows up in our financial statement.
But last year, Morton Thiokol's overall earnings went up 30 cents a share despite the accident. Unlike the congressman, Wall Street sees no problem with that increase. Analyst Jim Cunningham.
I don't think they should have had to pay the $10 million penalty because I think it was NASA's fault, not their fault. And I also don't think that they should be forced for public relations reasons just to satisfy the American public or congressional critics not to make money on a big effort, a lot of work, and I think it's unfair after the fact to say you would have made money on this, but now you won't, and I think the pure reason was for public opinion.
Competitors of Morton Thiokol had hoped NASA would turn to them after the accident, at least as a second source or backup to Thiokol. A West Coast competitor says it can solve the faulty joint problem completely. The Aerojet Corporation's huge rocket has no field joints at all. Their propellant is poured into a rocket that is already assembled and lined with a protective insulation, though there are problems in transporting such a huge rocket.
Hercules is ready today.
Back in Utah, Hercules Corporation says the technology in its rocket manufacturing plant is superior to Morton Thiokol's. The company has pioneered the use of robots in its plant. Computers totally control production facilities, which the company says means a higher level of quality control and safety. Hercules says its modern facilities would allow it to produce rockets for 30% less than Morton Thiokol. Congressman Scheuer says the advantage any company can provide is competition.
It seems to me that it's perfectly obvious that there ought to be competition, and that the sole source method of proceeding is not wise, is not sound. I don't say we should exclude Morton Thiokol, but as a citizen of this country, let alone as a congressman, as a citizen in this country, I don't want to let the continuity and the success of our long-term space effort be utterly dependent on this one contractor whose performance has been so flawed.
NASA has announced that there will be competition for the next generation of solid rockets. But the advanced rockets would not be used before the mid-1990s, if at all. And until then, Morton Thiokol has the solid rocket contract locked up.
We are the #1 solid propulsion company in the United States. We have over 40% of the business, which means that we didn't get there accidentally. So we are competent. We have a good record.
But there is one former Morton Thiokol employee who is still severely troubled by the record of his former company. Roger Beaujolais was the engineer who fought the hardest to stop the launch the night before the Challenger tragedy. That night still haunts him, and he has spent much of the last year trying to recover.
I punished myself with hard labor in my backyard moving rocks, and I used to come in late in the afternoon, basically physically exhausted, and I did that primarily so I could sleep at night. I had a very difficult time because in the first parts of my leaving, I blamed myself for the disaster and not fighting hard enough to stop it. And then after much mind searching, I realized that I did all I could do, and it wasn't my fault. that they launched, and those people died because I had done my best to stop it, realizing through this mind searching that I was talking to the right people that night. I was talking to the people that could have stopped the launch, but decided not to.
Beaujolais left Morton Thiokol and filed a $1 billion suit against the company, claiming that Thiokol defamed him for telling the truth about the faulty rocket joints. In the lawsuit, Beaujolais also accuses Thiokol of poor quality control and safety practices, both before and after the accident. A safety report done by the Air Force after the accident calls Thiokol's implementation of needed safety reforms dismal. And as recently as last month, Thiokol's management was still resisting NASA's demand to hire additional safety personnel. For Roger Beaujolais, all this means that little has changed at Morton Thiokol.
It's very, very gut-wrenching to know that people who are in decision-making positions have not learned anything from past disasters.
The company will not talk about Roger Beaujolais' lawsuit, nor will it talk about the FBI investigation instigated by a group of Morton Thiokol employees. But Ed Garrison says many changes have been made at Morton Thiokol, both in personnel and procedures. And he points with pride to the round-the-clock effort Thiokol has made to fix the faulty joint and get the shuttle in the air again.
We have a large number of engineering and management people that have sacrificed their vacation, they've sacrificed their weekends, they've sacrificed their family life, and they have practically lived at the plant for 16 months. A true dedication to the employees, and we're very proud of them.
Has Morton Thiokol been hurt this year?
Oh, very much so. I think we feel like we've been under siege by everyone, the press, Congress, our competitors. But we still had a lot of support, too. We have won, through competition, about $250 million worth of business in the last 16 months. So that says that our customers still have confidence in us.
NASA is one customer that has maintained its confidence in Morton Thiokol. So despite the critics, it is this company that will largely determine if and when America's space program returns to the skies.
The first full-scale test of the newly designed rocket is scheduled for the last week of August.
Finally tonight, our regular Washington essayist Roger Mudd looks at the coming confirmation battle for the man President Reagan has chosen for the Supreme Court, Robert Bork.
It is hard to imagine a presidential appointment with higher stakes for everyone involved than President Reagan's nomination of Robert Bork to the United States Supreme Court. First, there is Mr. Reagan himself, approaching the twilight of his presidency, but with an unparalleled chance to stamp the court with his own ideological brand. There is the 60-year-old nominee, Judge Bork, currently of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, an implacable conservative of formidable intellect and wit, but best known as the man who fired Archibald Cox during Watergate. There is the Supreme Court of the United States, the third branch of government, whose future direction could swing sharply to the right on such issues as the death penalty, abortion, homosexual rights, federal aid to parochial schools. There is the reputation of White House Chief of Staff Howard Baker, whose skill at maneuvering the Bork nomination through a hostile Senate will be on the line. There is, of course, the Democratic Party, out of power for almost 8 years, going on 16, so long that it seems to have forgot that it's the president and not the opposition who gets to appoint the court. At stake also are the presidential ambitions of Joseph Biden, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who has already announced he knows enough about Robert Bork to have a closed mind, and the presidential ambitions of Robert Dole of Kansas, the Senate's Republican leader who, like it or not, must manage the Bork nomination without alienating his party's right wing. What it all adds up to could be the most bruising fight since the Senate rejected the Carswell and Haynesworth nominations from President Nixon in 1969 and 70. and the most pivotal appointment since John Kennedy's 1962 nomination of Arthur Goldberg, which locked in a liberal majority on the Warren Court. It also adds up to another day of reckoning for the United States Senate and its role in presidential nominations to the court. The Constitution gives the Senate no guidelines. It says only the President shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint judges. It lists no job qualifications, no law school degrees, no minimum age, no citizenship, no character traits.
Senator Hatch has the floor.
The Senate is on its own in deciding whether a nominee will be able to handle the burning issues of today, as well as those of 20 years hence. No senator can say with total confidence that a nominee to the court will make a bad judge. So over the years, a rough rule has emerged that if the nominee is from neither the extreme left nor the extreme right, but is professionally competent by training, experience, and temperament, then a president is entitled to have his choice confirmed by the Senate without delay. But the Bork nomination has generated a different set of rules. Judicial fitness, say the Democrats, is not enough any longer. The Senate must also consider Bork's ideology. It must consider the balance of the court as a whole. The delicate balance is in jeopardy, they say. Senator Biden says Ronald Reagan is trying to remake the court in his own image. Does all that sound familiar? It sure does.
I'm not impressed with Justice Spaulders or what he has to say because...
It is almost word for word what Republican Senator Strom Thurmond was saying 20 years ago when Lyndon Johnson tried to elevate the liberal Abe Fortas from Associate Justice to Chief Justice.
His decisions have turned loose criminals. They have allowed communists to work in defense plants. They have allowed communists to teach in schools and colleges. They have invaded the rights of the states and centralized more power in Washington. And I personally am just not in accord with that line of thinking.
Thurmond and the conservatives filibustered Fortas into withdrawing his nomination, just as the Democrats hope they can do to Bork. So the rule about ideology playing no part in the Senate's advise and consent role works. Works, that is, until there's a presidential election just around the corner. Remember, it's been 20 years since a Democratic president got to make an appointment to the Supreme Court.
Again, the major stories of this Tuesday. Iran finished the first day of naval maneuvers in the Persian Gulf without incident, and the Federal Communications Commission voted to do away with the fairness doctrine governing the broadcast of controversial issues on radio and television. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Jim. That's the News Hour tonight, and we will be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Funding for the MacNeil-era News Hour is provided by AT&T, combining everything people like about telephones with everything they expect from computers to make everything about information easy. AT&T. Funding also is provided by this station and other public television stations and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
It's 1:58 a.m., current temperature 74 degrees.